Welcome to Library Seminars, a platform for the presentation of ideas, research, and news in support of NOAA's mission. I'm Lisa Clark, Reference Librarian at the NOAA Central Library. Today's presentation, titled Taking Action Based on Science, Emergency Management, Decision-Making in Severe Weather, is sponsored by the National Weather Service. Venkita Brown, social scientist at the National Weather Service, will introduce our speakers. But before the presentation begins, here are a few housekeeping items. If you're having trouble with the audio or visual components of GoToWebinar, please log out and rejoin us. This usually resolves technical issues. This presentation is being recorded and will be available later this afternoon at the NOAA Central Library YouTube channel, as well as the Library Seminars website. We will also be accepting questions throughout the webinar, which the speakers will address at the very end of their presentation. Please feel free to type your questions in the question chat box on the right side of your screen at any time. So with that, I thank you for attending the library seminar today and turn the presentation over to Venkita.
Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you're joining from. Thank you, Lisa. As Lisa mentioned, I am a social scientist here at the National Weather Service, and I also belong to a social science community of practice at NOAA. And as any community of practice, we like to share and share research and support our scientists in sharing their research, as is the case today with this team of scientists and practitioners. I became aware of the work of this team as an external review committee member for one of the National Science Foundation programs, the Partnerships for International Research and Education. This particular partnership is between the US and Taiwan, and it includes several universities. And the focus is on addressing the challenges of weather resilience with a focus on reducing impacts to extreme precipitation through the enhancement of weather and climate models, and also gaining a better understanding of decision-making in response to extreme weather. So it aligns very well with the work of the Weather Service and the interest of NOAA. And so I wanted to make their work available to the NOAA community and also our emergency management community as well. So I'm really excited to hear more about the projects today. And really briefly, I'm so sorry about the one we had to cancel yesterday. One of the panelists got sick, but we're hoping to reschedule next year for that presentation as well. They are a team, and the work they're doing is really exciting, so hoping to reschedule. But I'm going to give a brief background on the panelists today, and then I'll get out of the way and we can start. Dr. Terri Adams-Fuller is a professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminology and interim director for NOAA's Cooperative Science Center for the Atmospheric Sciences and Meteorology at Howard University. Her research takes an interdisciplinary approach to examining issues that have both theoretical and practical implications. Dr. Adams-Fuller's most recent work focuses on the decision-making processes of both individuals and organizations in the face of natural disasters. Mr. Jayson Kratoville is an interim director of the National Center for Security and Preparedness at the University of Albany's College of Emergency Preparedness, Homeland Security, and Cybersecurity. He works with people and organizations as they adapt to emerging science, technology, and threats. He has led teams of subject matter experts to build and deliver behavioral training courses of tens of thousands of first responders, emergency managers, and other Homeland Security professionals. Welcome to our panelists. I'll just say that unfortunately, Dr. Adams-Fuller, her camera is not working, so you will not see her face, but you will definitely hear her voice. So Dr. Adams, please start your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Venkita, for inviting us. Very happy to be here. So again, our talk is entitled Taking Action Based on Science, Emergency Management, Decision-Making in Severe Weather. So Venkita has just introduced us. Just to provide a little background about the work that we're about to present, the project that I'm presenting is actually a part of a larger study entitled Building Weather Extremes Through Improved Weather and Climate Prediction and Modeling Strategies, supported by the National Science Foundation's Partnerships and International Research and Education Program. The work that I'm presenting is also indirectly supported by the U.S. Department of Commerce, NOAA Educational Partnership Program, which, and I'd say it's indirectly supported because I've had the pleasure of training students using this project. And so it has been a project, again, that's been supported by both NSF and as well as NOAA. So the project is a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and multi-institutional project with partners in the U.S. as well as in Taiwan. The lead here in the U.S. has been Everett Joseph, and the lead in Taiwan is Dr. Pei Ling. And we represent the decision support team. The decision support team examines risk perceptions, crisis response, and individual and organizational differences in decision-making practices and response to information on severe weather events. And Jayson is going to focus on the efforts that he's been leading up at the University of Albany as it pertains to some of the training exercises. Sorry, I'm having some challenges here. The presentation reviews the preliminary findings on the internal and external factors that impacted decision-making practices of emergency managers during severe weather events. So again, this is a part of a larger project, but this particular presentation is just focused on examining internal, and external factors that impact decision-making among emergency managers. So why this research? Well, emergency managers serve as an important link between the prediction tools and the public. Their ability to process, interpret, and communicate warnings effectively to the public is essential to the mitigation of severe weather threats. As the weather enterprise continues to improve products, it is important to advance our understanding of how people make decisions. It is believed that gaining a better understanding of what impacts the decision-making process of emergency managers can help improve the development of effective decision support tools. So the research questions being addressed today include: what types of tools, technology, and information sources are available to EMs during severe weather events? Are EMs comfortable with probabilistic information? What factors impact the decisions made by emergency managers during severe weather events? And these are factors that are outside of the weather information that they, of course, receive. The internal factors examined include their experience, their need for closure, their need for cognition, and tolerance for ambiguity. The external factors include public and workplace policies, work environments, employer expectations and needs, the public expectations, as well as meteorological information. So this component of the project is interdisciplinary by itself. So the overall project, of course, is interdisciplinary, but this particular research that I'm sharing with you today is also interdisciplinary, in that involves the inclusion of social science, atmospheric sciences, computer science, and with the ultimate goal of merging these data into a virtual world. So under the social science, concepts and theories are being tested related to the disciplines of sociology, psychology, economics, and public administration. And of course, we're using weather data from the atmospheric science, our atmospheric scientists counterparts. And I have been engaged in work with a computer scientist at my institution, Dr. Gloria Washington. And again, the ultimate goal is to converge all of this information into a virtual world. The data collection. We have been engaged in collecting both qualitative and quantitative data. I have had the fortunate ability to engage in research at the National Severe Storms Laboratory test bed from 2016 to 2019, and That has involved sending students there to help with the data collection on the part of the scientists at the test bed, as well as having the opportunity to have some of our research questions addressed. And as most of you who are on the call know, the NSSL, the test bed involves multiple stakeholders, including NOAA staff, industry, as well as university scholars like myself. Their experiments include the testing of enhanced communication streams, new products, and new processes that NOAA has an intent to eventually launch. It has involved tabletop exercises, which include both what are called CAN cases, as well as real-life, real-time events. Participants have included emergency managers, weather forecasters, as well as broadcast meteorologists. Components of the research include a pre-experiment questionnaire that assesses the internal factors such as one's tolerance for change, one's tolerance for ambiguity, risk literacy, the ability to interpret numbers effectively, need for closure, the desire for answers, forecast preferences, and experience with weather. And then there, of course, is the experiment that includes accessing and using some of the NOAA products. During this time, focus groups are held where participants are asked after the use of various products about their preferences for information type, whether or not if they like the product, things that they had challenges with, and so on and so forth. And then the post-experiment interviews are also conducted where the participants are asked questions related to their preference for information type, prior experience. We ask them questions that try to get at the external factors that impacted decision making, including, as was mentioned earlier, their work conditions, relationships with the public, and so on and so forth. So the study participants, the majority of the emergency managers that have participated in the studies have interviewed, I should say, are full-time professionals, while others work multiple jobs or have multiple roles. Very few have meteorological training, but all, of course, are interested in weather impacts. They are demographically homogeneous. Most received state training, and while most are aware of federal training, they don't always take advantage or don't have the opportunity to take advantage of those opportunities. The preliminary findings. Sources used by EMs to receive and distribute information during severe weather events include the NWS reports, NWS chat, radar data, media data, of course, local news, the Weather Channel, as well as local cameras for those who have spotter networks and other types of networks. In terms of how they communicate the information, of course, they communicate the information to their superiors. They also communicate via using social media. They communicate information through the EM information systems, text messaging, email, and outdoor warning sirens, as well as 911 reverse calls. Key findings related to these data include that EMs have access to a variety of different data sources. All of the EMs that we have interviewed have relied primarily on products from the National Weather Service, and most notably use area forecast discussions, mesoscale discussion, and the EPC convection outlooks. Now, moving on to looking at internal factors. Factors such as tolerance for ambiguity, need for closure, and risk literacy. A variety of questions have been asked of the study participants. All of the questions are based on the scales that are noted here and have been validated. Among the findings, we found that across the US samples that participants report a high need for cognition. They have a tendency to engage in and enjoy eventful cognitive activities. And this has been shown to affect behavior and problem solving and decision making. Across the samples, participants report self-report a high ability for working with numerical information, and their preference for working with numerical information over text is even higher. Participants reported an average to low need for closure, that is, having a desire for definitive knowledge on some issue or for a firm answer to a question, and an aversion to ambiguity. These preliminary findings suggest that emergency managers are comfortable with uncertainty and therefore probably more likely comfortable with using probabilistic information. Moving on to looking at external factors. Again, we have asked a variety of different questions related to what are some of the factors outside of the weather information that you receive that impact your decision making. So we ask questions like, when and how do you obtain your weather information? What are some of the factors that contribute to you making an emergency related decision? And how much influence does the public perception have on your decision making? These are just a small sample of the variety of questions that are asked. Here are some of the direct quotes from some of our participants. When asked about workplace requirements, one participant stated that their city should probably have 15 to 20 full-time employees in their department. They have 4, a staff of 3 right now, and there's just not nearly enough resources for what the risks really are, one person stated. Another person states, I am the emergency manager, I am the fire chief, I am the floodplain administrator. That kind of thing. Well, if something hits, what do I focus on? Someone else notes, I am a one-man show. Moving on to looking at the question related to training, one person stated, the certified emergency management is great, but I don't see a lot of that happening at this point. Another person notes that inferred that emergency management is somewhat hierarchical in that sense. Don't question authority, don't critically think, just do what is asked. In regards to questions related to the media influence, one person states, I want to know if residents have been told that they're going to be gone tomorrow, that this is really important because the psychology that sets in before the storm gets there is probably as important as the storm is. Another person states, duct tape the broadcasters' mouths so they don't tell them to run out in the flooded roads. One other person stated, people will ask, well, isn't the Weather Channel the National Weather Service? What? Are you kidding? I thought you all would really appreciate that quote. Related to policy implications, one person shared, we have cities that have become cities because they hate the county they're in. And meanwhile, we still have to work together because the public really doesn't understand in a lot of cases that they don't even know what jurisdictions they're in. So they don't care that it is a jurisdictional problem. They just care that they need help. Another person states, and the reality of that is we're just the glue that keeps all of that coordination going up. You're passing information back and forth. You're getting departments to talk to each other who hate each other. So looking at the data, the preliminary data that relates to the external factors, what we have found is that workplace requirements, various protocols impact their decision making. The media, outside communication influences impact the decision making, as well as concerns about public opinion. To summarize the findings, EM training and capacity vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Most, if not, have many other responsibilities. So they are emergency managers, but they might serve other responsibilities that are, for some, works in tandem with their EM responsibilities. For others, it's completely different. EMs use weather data for sure, but most are not trained in meteorology. EMs are comfortable with uncertainty and have a potential comfort with probabilistic risk information. Most report having a high degree of numeracy and level of comfort with numerical information. However, when asked about messaging specifically, most report that they would prefer text with numerical information combined together. EMs are influenced by factors outside of the weather data they receive during severe weather events, which include workplace pressures, prior training, and the media. Several struggle with the lack of authority they have and simultaneously the intense pressure that they have from the public. So that just basically summarizes where we are with the research as it relates to how emergency managers are making decisions. Moving forward, we were actually intended to launch this summer, but of course, with the COVID-19 pandemic, we decided to hold back, but we are going to launch an online experiment that will help us advance the collection of data. And it will help us advance the collection of data because we're not just relying on collecting information in face-to-face scenarios. So I'm hoping that this link works. It worked earlier today. So this is an example of a landing page that the participants will reach. There are 3 scenarios that they can choose from. There's a description of the scenario. Then they will be taken to a survey map where they can navigate themselves to the various addresses that are pertinent to the scenarios that they are going to be presented with. And the scenario will also, the web-based product will also include a ability for the participant, I should say, to access, be able to really kind of zero down into looking at a particular geographic space they're being asked to make decisions on. And with the ultimate goal at some point to create a gaming system that can both allow us to collect data as well as potentially provide for opportunities for our training. We also are looking to include a simulated weather event, and this is just a small sample of the kind of like the pilot of where we were going with this. So this is a geographic space in which the end users will be asked to make decisions on. And then what you'll see coming in here fairly shortly are rain clouds that are going to emerge. And again, this is just a beta product that the computer science students have been working on. So that's just a little bit about where we intend to go. Again, why this work is really important because decisions made early on really determine if we're going to just experience, let's say, a weather event or a public crisis. So that's the end of my presentation, and I look forward to taking questions later on. Thank you. Jayson is up next.
Thanks very much. Just allow me a second to get the right screen here. So, and I'm going to put my webcam on as well so you guys can see me a little bit. So, thank you, Terri. And before I dive into too much explanation of what we're here to discuss, I want to continue pulling a thread that Terri brought up midway through. She talked about 2 things at once: the where emergency managers come from, and that they also often have dual roles. A lot of times, those roles They either came from or have a dual role in the first responder space. And I also want to talk about how that might map to their tolerance for information and probabilistic information and data, and how that maps to what we're trying to do here. So this picture may look just a little bit graphic, but it's actually staged. It's from a training course that we did on mass casualty incidents. Mass casualty incident being an incident where your problem outpaces your resources. So that's the boots on the ground version of somewhat what Terri was talking about, which was you end up in a situation where there's so much to do and you're only one person. How do you figure it out? So the paramedic in the middle, we'll call her Diana, that's not her name. Paramedic in the middle is actually writing some things down. And believe it or not, amidst all this chaos, she's collecting data. Now, she's not a researcher, she's not gonna run it through Stata later, but she's going through a practice called triage, which many of you are probably familiar with. Basically what you're doing is you're taking a bunch of medical information on each of the victims that you see in this shot and distilling that down into one data point. That data point's usually a color, red, green, yellow, sometimes even gray, orange, blue. But there's a sort of shared understanding about what those colors stand for and how you prioritize action across different people based on those colors, right? So you've taken complexity on things like what's their pulse rate, you know, to what extent are they bleeding, what are their respirations, do they have an altered mental status, are they able to answer questions? All of those things get distilled down into one data point to make it more manageable as you're trying to sift through this complexity, get people treated and get people off scene and to terminal care facilities like hospitals, trauma centers, things like that. And so one of the thought experiments I like to play with this is imagine if these glasses that I'm wearing contained an augmented reality display, where when you get on scene, the first person who sort of goes around has sensors that collect all of that data that I was talking about and distill it down. And then everybody who arrives after that gets, you know, basically pointed in a direction on this display to what patient they need to take care of, what they need to do, and where they need to move them. It's not science fiction. I think we're moving down this road, and folks are already using some of that data to help share information among first responders and with hospitals. So it sounds great, but what do you do when you show up on scene and next to each other are, say, a father and son? Son is maybe a yellow, you know, has a broken leg, but, you know, is going to be okay. The father is more critical. And your augmented reality display tells you, take the father, prioritize 2 other patients, and then come back for the son. You're probably not going to do that. And what that illustrates is exactly what Terri talked about, which is that there are more things that factor into the decision you're making than the data on the problem that you're facing. There's biases, there's ethical situations like the one we just talked about. You're experiencing stress, the people around you are experiencing stress. There are different laws and rules in terms of what you can do and what you can't do. And so when I listen to presentations from atmospheric scientists and I hear about chaos theory, perturbations, microphysics, and the vast complexity of things that influence what a storm is going to do, my response to that is the dynamics of individual and group decisions are at least equally as complex. But the key difference, and the thing that we're going to focus on going forward to find a solution to some of the problems that Terri outlined from her research, is that we can actually influence the decision of this. We can change the way that today make decisions, which we're going to talk about today, and actually also the way that the public makes decisions, which is what yesterday's presentation was going to be and will be the presentation sometime early next year. So our center, the National Center for Security and Preparedness at the University at Albany, is in the change business. We take a look at an emerging technology, an emerging process, where it's going to run into issues getting implemented into the field and how we fix those issues. So we got involved in the wider project that Dr. Adams-Fuller outlined in her presentation about 2 years ago now. and saw an opportunity to take some of the techniques that this research group was using, some of the advancements, and change the way that emergency managers were thinking about, or adapt the way that emergency managers were thinking about risk and probability when it comes to severe weather. So Terri outlined some of the barriers to this, that there's some uneven background in training. Some people have multiple roles. There's issues with access to training and different knowledge bases. But there are also some opportunities there. There is the high tolerance among this group to both learning and to looking at data. There is sort of a field-wide effort to professionalize emergency management, meaning to build a distinct profession around it with professional standards. The same thing is happening on the research side and trying to build sort of a distinct pot of research. And a lot of that circles on the ability to use data to make emergency managers better at that coordinated role that that Terri was talking about. And many emergency managers are already quite adept at that. So what we would like to do is build and deliver a severe weather and risk management training course that dives into the unpredictability of storms, how that relates to your jurisdiction or a particular scenario, forces you to kind of think through a scenario based on some of the probabilities and risks that we lay out in front of you, and get you to think a little bit differently about that thought process. So to dive into that detail, let's talk about risk for just a second. So when we talk about forecasts and how forecasts are presented and modeled, we're primarily talking about the threat side of risk. Risk being broken down into threat, vulnerability, and consequence. Sometimes you see risk equations as simple as risk equals threat times vulnerability times consequence. Many are more complicated than that. But at the most fundamental level, you're talking about threat, vulnerability, and consequence. So when you're presenting a weather forecast, you're basically providing intelligence on your threat. There's a certain percentage that the storm is going to do X, and here's the range of possibilities. What the emergency manager then needs to be able to do to understand the vulnerabilities in their jurisdiction, which areas are flood prone, which portions of the population are more resilient to a particular type of storm. For example, if you're going to get stranded, but you live in an area where you're used to being a little bit more self-sufficient, say a rural area, that area is perhaps less vulnerable to disruption than a city where things need to constantly be flowing, right? And then you need to look at the potential consequences. What's going to happen in this area? The reason that this is important is because the highest probability threat is not always the biggest concern, right? So the thing that's most likely to happen may not be the worst case scenario, because you could have a lower probability scenario that may be a lower probability threat that may be hitting a higher vulnerability area and yield a higher consequence. For example, if you have a storm that might hit, the rural areas of upstate New York, it's most likely to hit those areas, but there's a chance that it's going to hit New York City. You have to be able to sort of quantify that chance to know just how big of a risk that is, because New York City is a more vulnerable area and there would be more consequences to that storm hitting New York City than say upstate New York. So our colleagues in Taiwan have an interesting way of looking at this that we think can sort of help frame emergency managers' thinking. They use what I'll call alternative futures on what the particular storm might look like. So if you look at this diagram, the portion that says PM is the sort of aggregate model. That's the forecast based on all of the different models. But then what they've done is clustered models into a few different alternative scenarios and provided a probability, 12 and 20, 3 and 20, 3 and 20, and 2 and 20, of each of these things happening. So in this particular example, cluster PM3 there, one of the 3 out of 20 options, because most of the urban areas in Taiwan are on the northern part of the island, those areas are a little bit more vulnerable, a little bit higher consequence. And so you might want to take a look at that model and you can explain not just, hey, there's some uncertainty related to this model that we're looking at. Here are some of the other things that might happen, and here's the probability that it might happen. Gives you a sense to break up your risk in a little bit more nuanced of a way. But the question is, emergency managers aren't using this by and large right now. And this, as Terri sort of outlined, we're trying to get emergency managers to think a little bit more this way, and they're receptive to that thinking. So how do we move the needle in that direction? Well, the most effective way we've seen to change the way people think about things, change their behavior, is training. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the theory behind how people receive and learn new information, and where that provides some insight into our process and our plan going forward. So there are many different types of adult learning theory. I'm going to focus on one that I think really usefully breaks up the way we learn and receive information into 3 buckets. One of them is the cognitive domain of learning. This is everything from, can I repeat a piece of information back to you, to how well can I analyze that information to ultimately generate new information or build on that information. That's the spectrum of cognitive learning. Psychomotor learning has to do with the way our brain connects with our physical actions. And so everything from being able to pick up and throw a ball to being able to pitch a perfect game. Just baseball reference there. And then somewhat neglected in the way that training is designed and the way people think about the way that people learn is the affective domain. How do you respond to that information? Are you resistant to it? Does it jive with your experience? Does it jive with what you learned originally when you first came into the field? If the answer to any of those questions is no, it doesn't matter if you understand the information that's coming across the table or can analyze it. It doesn't matter if you can physically do the thing we're asking you to do. If you're resistant to it because it's not the way you've been doing it and you don't have the experience to show that it's been successful, it sort of locks down these other areas of learning. This is, in our experience, somewhat amplified for the emergency management and response community because they deal so acutely and so frequently with life and death situations, and also high stress, quick decision-making situations where you're defaulting to sort of those base instincts. And so what we suggest and what we push going forward is that when you're designing training, you have to make sure that by the time they leave your course, whether it's 4 days or 4 hours, that you've made a change in the affective domain to unlock the cognitive and psychomotor learning that needs to happen elsewhere. So in developing our course going forward, one of the more effective ways to do that is through scenarios like the ones that Terri outlined earlier, where you put somebody in a situation that's specifically designed to show how well thinking about things based on risk and probabilities allows you to both make decisions and communicate those decisions to policymakers, the public, your fellow emergency managers, etc. And by learning from those scenarios, if you actually use it, see the consequences, positive and negative, of the way that you conceptualize this information, it allows you to, for lack of a better term, believe in what you're doing, which not only kind of unlocks that cognitive and psychomotor learning in the course itself, but will then make that person somewhat curious to learn more about it and practice it on their own, which really amplifies the impact you're able to have with the work that you're doing. We saw this most acutely with integrated response and rescue task force for active shooter situations, where there was huge resistance at first to EMS working really closely with law enforcement and going into sort of moderate threat areas to treat patients. And we were able to show people in those scenarios that it actually works well without really putting EMS in any more danger than they were in by showing up to the scene in the first place, if you do it correctly. And what that led to is, as the national standards started to shift to that, we had this whole baseline of people who took the training who were already open to the idea and tracking processes, and even in some cases working within their jurisdictions to make it happen. So what are our steps forward? So we use a very common training development archetype known as ADDIE, which is an acronym for Analyze, Design, Develop, Implement, and Evaluate. And so I'm going to sort of structure our action plan going forward and where this audience that I'm talking to right now can fit into it based on that structure. So the first thing we're going to do in analyzing the need and the concept of the course that we're designing to respond to that need is to convene a group of emergency managers, atmospheric scientists, and social scientists to talk about that need. That's three very distinct perspectives on the problem that we're hoping to sort of bring together, have them almost duke it out for however long it takes, and come up with sort of an agreed upon model for, hey, these are the competencies you need to be an effective risk and data-based decision maker when it comes to severe weather. Once we've done that, we'll move into the design phase. From that broader group, we'll identify a group of sort of interested parties who want to be a little bit more involved in the process as we develop the course out. And we'll start to map training objectives, learning objectives, and the modules that they fit within. From there, we'll actually start to build the content. So that's, there's going to be a lot of theoretical content in there on risk, on forecasting and chaos theory and uncertainty that sort of create a baseline in the course. But we're also going to build scenarios similar to the ones that Terri presented that are specifically designed to hit the training objectives that we came up with in the design phase, right? They're designed. So a good example of this is here at the university when we were working on implementing surveillance testing for COVID-19. We did a decision-making course where we specifically designed a scenario that showed the benefit of having good information on asymptomatic cases to making decisions. And so you could see the consequence of both having it and not having it based on the scenarios that we did. So we're going to design those scenarios, we're going to design the training modules, and then we're going to deliver a pilot with some key stakeholders who we think might be interested in diving into this course a little bit going forward, and also those who have helped us build it. The last phase that I want to talk about is this evaluation phase, which is where I think that this ties to future research in much the same way that Terri was talking about earlier. So when you evaluate training, you look at 4 levels of effectiveness. The first is the one that's most commonly evaluated, which was, did you like the course? That's level 1. The second is, can we demonstrate that you learned? This could be through a pre and post test. This could also be through expert evaluation from the instructional cadre. The third level is a little bit more longitudinal. It's 6 months from now, a year from now, are you still using these concepts? Are you still thinking about these things? Have they impacted your day-to-day as a participant? And then level 4 is, how did this impact the field? Did your jurisdiction get better at something? Did you implement this type of thinking across your jurisdiction? Things like that. And that's even more long-term as we sort of evaluate the effectiveness of training. We think that these learning levels and this evaluation strategy can connect with research like being done at Howard, like the research that's being done at Howard University on decision science. So to sort of sum up what we're trying to do with this whole project and where we think it can be helpful going forward, you have the interdisciplinary research that Terri talked about. So this decision science research obviously helps us frame how we're going to drive the change that we want to drive, but also the increased forecasting effectiveness and forecast visualization tools that are coming out of emerging research as we speak. And this can include artificial intelligence, machine learning, things like that, tools that are helpful in analyzing this information that we want emergency managers to use. That innovation is what drives the training. And the training is what sort of changes the way that emergency managers are thinking during the crisis and conveying information during the crisis. And that cycle sort of continues to double back on itself as we keep innovating faster and faster in some of these key areas and trying to make us better at predicting what weather is going to do and making good decisions based on those predictions in order to save lives. So I think we're going to move on to the question period now. My contact information is here. Please reach out both with any questions and if you're interested in being part of the development or piloting of this training. Thank you all so much for your time today. Thank you to Dr. Brown for inviting us, and I look forward to your questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Terri and Jayson. Your presentations have actually generated lots of questions. So audience, I will take the next, I guess, about 15 minutes to answer your questions. So please continue to type them in the questions box on the right side, and I will read them to both Terri and Jayson. So let me start with this first question that someone sent in. It said, how did you measure tolerance for change and tolerance for ambiguity?
Okay, thank you for the question. And again, I apologize. I don't know why I can't figure out how to turn this camera on. But if Jayson, if you could switch to the slide where the two of us are at, so I'm not totally anonymous here. Well, we used a scale, the tolerance for ambiguity scale, and there was a set of questions that are geared towards measuring one's tolerance for ambiguity. That's the response.
Thank you. Excellent, thank you. Someone else asked, can you expand on what you mean that the participants are demographically homogenous?
Meaning that most of the participants were male, most of the participants were over the age of 45, past 50, and most were white.
Great, thank you for answering that. The next question asks, or actually is a little bit of a comment. The slide about lack of full-time or experienced EMs is an eye-opener. We always hear, listen to the EMs, and yet many aren't really experienced. Any comments on that?
Yes, and I think Jayson can actually answer this question probably better or more fully than I can. It is surprising, especially given the importance of emergency management or emergency managers, I should say, this day and age. I think in most of the larger jurisdictions, like the city that I'm in and the city that Jayson's in, you do have full-time staff, but in some of the smaller jurisdictions where, of course, the weather is still severe in various places, you do find that people are engaging in multiple tasks or have responsibility for multiple roles. Jayson?
Absolutely. And I do think that in that professionalization effort, it's something that people are both trying to change and inform, where even if you end up having somebody who's a part-time emergency manager and say a part-time, broader public safety role, that they still have some of this baseline training. But I think that in the meantime, where I'll somewhat defend that group of people is that there's a revealing comment in there about being sort of the quarterback for information. And that's the biggest thing you have to look to your emergency manager to be, right? Emergency manager doesn't need to be an expert in every aspect of what they're doing. They need to be able to take those experts and move them in a direction to actually make decisions and get things done. So that is a little bit more the skill set that we're talking about. So when you look at expertise, what you're really looking for first and foremost in an emergency manager is somebody who is good at that. And then if they're an expert in different areas, it adds on to that from there. And so sometimes you will, so for example, one of the more effective local emergency managers I know runs a dispatch center. And that's his experience, is just dispatcher. It's also an EMT. And both of those roles gave him that skill set where he's one of the better coordinators that I've ever met. And he works in sort of a large suburban area that's heavily impacted by winter weather, and is again able to basically say, hey, I don't know about this, but this person does. This person, come on over here, take care of that. Okay, what's the next thing? So I think about it that way a little bit too, even as we start to build out this field and get a sense for what an emergency manager really is.
Excellent, thank you. The next question asks, did you find positive examples of the interactions between media, EMs, and the National Weather Service? Duct taping mouths does seem extreme.
Yes, I would say it is indeed extreme. Thinking back on the data, most of the participants voiced some level of frustration with some of the information that is put out to the public, but not all were that extreme.
Great. This next question states, in my opinion, an EM's critical thinking ability directly affects their risk literacy. This includes their ability to do a risk assessment and the control measures to be considered for implementation. Would you agree that this internal factor can be said to be directly proportional to an EM's level of education?
Yes and no. And I'll let Jayson add on to this response. So I think, of course, education is going to impact directly your literacy with numerical information. But some people have a greater tolerance for using numerical information, while others gravitate more to needing more of a descriptive kind of analysis of the situation. And as I noted before, what we've found is that most people want a combination of both. So I would say that the person who asked the questions, both, it's a yes and kind of question response I would give. Jayson?
I completely agree. And I'll preface this by saying that coming from an educational institution, I want more people to come to college for this particular field. But what I would say is, I'll quote Kant, one of my favorite quotes from Kant, which is that theory without practice is blind, practice without theory is blind, but theory without practice is mere intellectual play. And I agree with Terri completely that you need both. You need both the ability to take that information in, and then the instincts born from experience to apply that information in a way that leads to good outcomes. So I would say yes, but I think that the two can't be seen as mutually exclusive, and it's where I applaud universities, and you're continuing to see this, that are providing incentives for mid-career practitioners to come back to school and learn some of these enhanced techniques in a way that they can contextualize based on their boots on the ground experience.
Mm-hmm. I would also add to what you just said, Jayson, that as you alluded to in your presentation, that practice makes perfect, but in a crisis situation, people revert back to what their instincts are. And we see this at multiple levels, including scenarios I'm trying not to talk about right now. But so whatever your propensity is and your ability to digest information in a fairly quick and effective means of it, is going to impact what kinds of information I think you would be more comfortable with.
Great. The next question asks, for the online exercises, how do we get that information to our core partners? Will there be a formal invitation sent to the National Weather Service?
Sure, we can do that. I think on one of my slides, hopefully you're going to put the slides up, correct? Are the slides going to be made available to folks?
If you send them to me, I can send them out to people who request them. Absolutely.
Okay. Yes, I would love that. And actually, my email address is tadams-fuller, Fuller, @howard.edu for anyone who's interested in reaching me directly.
Great. Actually, there's a follow-up to that question from the same gentleman. Would the National Weather Service offices be able to incorporate these scenarios into our integrated warning team workshops?
I would be open to that, definitely.
I would also add to that is somewhat what we're also trying to do with the training. And so anywhere where we can sort of overlap effort on that, I think would be good. And I also would be interested in, as we start to build the training and pilot the training, sharing that information in much the same way as the research scenarios.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we can tag team on that, Jayson.
Great. The next question asks, how are you including rural emergency managers and scenarios?
So the National Severe Storms Laboratory, they recruit people from around the country. And in regards to the web-based scenarios and what we intend to do, we intend to get as many people, many emergency managers from around the country to participate. So we're not just focused on the large cities. We're going to hopefully recruit people from the suburban and rural communities as well.
Great. This next person says, I'd like to be involved in the risk management training course and would like to know how or if that is possible.
So again, my contact information is going to be, both mine and Terry's contact information are going to be on the slides. And I'd say reach out to either me directly at jkratoville@albany.edu or Terry at the email address that she just put up.
Okay, this next question you briefly touched upon, but I will repeat it. Will you be including rural emergency managers in the course design? When I say rural, I'm asking about counties in, say, rural New Mexico, Montana, or rural Missouri, counties with 6,000 or fewer people.
Absolutely. I think that what I find is that the more diversity in the group that's designing, especially the course concept, the better things go. The best example I can think of this is sometimes in the training that we do, we'll end up with participants from New York City and participants from the very rural areas of New York State. And what we'll find is that in the comments for courses, the folks from New York City will like having heard that other perspective, even from the perspective of somebody in New York City. So absolutely, there's a huge benefit to that, and we wouldn't have it any other way.
Great. I'm going to combine two questions that are related. The first question asks, what is swarm training? And then the second question says, can you provide an example of a scenario that will be built into the swarm training?
So SWARM standing for Severe Weather and Risk Management. It's more of a working title, but we liked that it was memorable. But the goal is to basically walk people through uncertainty in weather forecasting, risk, how those two things come together, and then as I think the question understood, put people through scenarios where they get to work through those things. So the scenarios could be a storm, I would say, like similar to, you could model it somewhat off of Sandy, which looked like it might swing a little bit upstate and then ended up really impacting New York City. You could do it based on wildfires. You could, how weather impacts wildfires. You could do it based on tornadoes. You could do it based on derechos, which I think I pronounced correctly. I'm still working on that. It's adaptable to any sort of scenario. And what I actually think we would probably do is design a bank of scenarios that's larger than the number of slots in the course, so that it can be adaptable to different geographic areas and needs. But the key of the scenarios would be to hit the training objective for people to understand how understanding that risk and probability helps them make better decisions. And so that's what's going to drive, how we take, say, a tornado scenario and make it useful from a training perspective.
Great. This next question is actually specifically for Terri. It asks, you briefly mentioned that the National Weather Service chat and National Weather Service forecast discussions are methods that EMs receive weather information. Do you have any insight into how EMs are using those information sources? Is one form of communication with EMs more effective than another?
Good question. Just generally speaking, I can just make a general statement that a comment, I should say, that they do access those two forms of information. In terms of, we haven't really asked which form or which type of information is most useful, but that is a question that we could ask moving forward. But I do know, I can say that the chat allows for kind of a back and forth dialogue. So it's not just one way, information going out. They can ask questions. And so that's a way of fine tuning their understanding of the information that's being produced.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Well, we actually have quite a few questions, but we've just hit 1 o'clock. And so if you don't mind, I'm going to forward these questions to the speakers just so that no one's question is ignored. They're fabulous questions.
Mm-hmm.
But before we end, did you have any last comments, either Venkita, Terri, or Jayson?
I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to present.
Yeah, and Peter, I just want to say thank you also to the panelists. Very excited to hear your work, and also to the folks who were able to join in today. Thank you for being a part. And again, we'll try to bring you that other presentation from yesterday in the new year. So thank you so much.
And thank you, Venkita, for bringing us here, and thanks to the participants for being so engaged. And I hope we're going to keep working together on this project. Thank you.
Oh, excellent. And I'd like just to remind everyone that this seminar is being recorded. So if you joined us late or you have a colleague you think you might enjoy this discussion, please send them the recording, which will be found on either the NOAA Central Library YouTube channel or the Library Seminars webpage. I would like to conclude by thanking Terri and Jayson for your excellent presentations and to Vankita for organizing this event. And this, I'd like to end by saying that the NOAA Central Library is very proud to present the work of the NOAA community and its partners. And I truly appreciate that people took the time to join us today for this seminar. And I hope you'll join us again. So be well all. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye.